Hello there, welcome back to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz the Gidello.
America's presidential election year is finally here, and after a 14-month campaign already, Republican voters are about to have their say for the first time. Do they want Donald Trump to come back, or is it time for them to turn the page?
They're very happy with the page, John. The polls suggest they absolutely want more Trump. Later, we're going to get an update on the Supreme Court case that will decide if Trump is even on the ballot. But first, over the next few days, we're going to be hearing a lot about the Iowa caucuses. They're Tuesday next week. So, John, how about a quick primer on what they are, what's involved, and what's at stake?
It would be my pleasure. Most of the votes held to decide America's presidential nominees are primary elections.
I've just had my say in the government of our country.
You register, turn up at a polling place, cast your ballot, and that's that. But a few states, including Iowa in the rural Midwest, hold caucuses instead.
It's Iowa caucus night! Let's party! Hooray!
Actually, less of a party, more of a political meeting held over an hour or two at night in a school gym, a church hall, even barns and living rooms in the old days.
People show up, listen to short speeches by advocates of the candidates, and vote.
That vote only comes after months of grassroots campaigning, organising and retail politicking across Iowa's 99 counties from plenty of would-be presidents.
Go to the caucuses! Stand for me! Help me become president!
But it's not always a slam dunk for the favourites. Far from it. Iowa has a history of producing upsets. 8 years ago, Donald Trump was the Republican frontrunner.
I know a lot of people in Iowa. I think they'll really like me. Let's give it a shot. They said, don't do it. I said, I have to do it.
But then along came Ted Cruz.
If conservatives show up tomorrow night, I believe we will win.
And Ted was right.
And CNN projects Ted Cruz, the Republican senator from Texas, will win the Iowa caucuses.
But as Ted Cruz soon found out, while winning Iowa can give your campaign a boost, it is not an automatic ticket to the White House. Just ask, still not President, Mike Huckabee.
It starts here in Iowa, but it doesn't end here. It goes all the way through the other states and ends at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue 1 year from now.
In fact, since the 1970s, only two Iowa caucus winners, Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Barack Obama, have gone on to become president. 5 other Iowa winners have become their party's nominee, and 8 others, including Huckabee, went pretty much nowhere. History suggests you are more likely to make that move into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue if you come second in Iowa's caucuses, like Carter, Reagan and Trump did.
We will go on to get the Republican nomination, and we will go on to easily beat Hillary or Bernie or whoever the hell they throw up there.
Turns out he was right too. But back to Iowa, and coming in the middle of winter on January 15th this year, the weather could well play a major part. Iowa gets bitterly cold.
Big drop in temperatures, easily our coldest of the season on the way, even some sub-zero overnights, and wind chills down the teens below zero ahead.
At 7 p.m. Monday local time, when the Iowa caucuses begin, the temperature in the capital Des Moines is expected to plunge to around minus 18 degrees Celsius. Plenty of Republicans might be wishing their party had gone the way of Democrats and turned their caucuses into a postal ballot. The other wild card is how many Democrats and independents switch their party affiliation to join a Republican caucus. So, who rugs up and turns out will decide if 2024 springs another Iowa caucus surprise.
4 more years!
And Chaz, while there has been plenty of snow on the ground in Iowa this week, public polls have been a little bit thinner on the ground, with the final Des Moines Register poll expected sometime over the weekend. The last poll taken before the holidays was from Insider Advantage, which had Trump still leading by 32 percentage points, with DeSantis and Haley tied for second on 17. And that is generally in line with the average of Iowa polls across the month of December.
Importantly, though, while we haven't got the super accurate Seltzer poll for...
That's the Des Moines Register one.
Yeah, for this weekend. As you say, we got back in December, and no candidate in history of the Iowa caucuses has lost when they've led in that December poll, that December Seltzer poll, by double digits. The last December poll had Trump ahead by 32 points.
Yeah, although history does say that sometimes there are late shifts in favour of one candidate or another. They can be a fickle bunch in Iowa, so let's not write it off just yet. There was an interesting shift in a poll from New Hampshire this week ahead of their primary, which is coming up on Tuesday the 23rd of January, Wednesday here. This is a CNN University of New Hampshire poll. It has former President Trump's lead narrowing dramatically. Nikki Haley rising fast, Ron DeSantis tumbling further. This all in a state where DeSantis briefly led Trump a year ago. Trump in this poll is just 7 points ahead of Nikki Haley. Then Chris Christie, Vivek Ramaswamy, and then DeSantis with just 5% support. Another poll this week from USA Today and Suffolk, though, had Trump 20 points clear, which is much closer to the average 21 points that Trump was leading across all New Hampshire polls for the month of December.
Yeah, forget that poll. That's not fun.
Yeah, not a lot to talk about there.
Let's focus on the close poll, John. A bit of wishful thinking. As you said, Trump was ahead by 7 points in New Hampshire with the close poll, with Chris Christie on 12 points. So that's more than the margin. Interestingly, Christie's supporters favoured Nikki Haley heavily as their second choice, with 65% of Christie's supporters saying they would support her if Chris Christie was not in the race. Only 10% of Christie's supporters said they would back anyone else. So that got a lot of people saying if Chris Christie really wanted to hurt Trump, he'd be better off dropping out and maximising Nikki Haley's chances of beating Trump in New Hampshire. And lo and behold, John.
Yes, indeed. Chris Christie made this announcement.
It's clear to me tonight that there isn't a path for me to win the nomination, which is why I'm suspending my campaign tonight for President of the United States.
Okay, so you know the routine. Dust off the board game. There goes Chris Christie. We always knew it was going to end like this, didn't we? But before he bowed out, he did have this pledge to his supporters.
I am going to make sure that in no way do I enable Donald Trump to ever be president of the United States again.
And let's give him credit. He was true to his word there. Like not many people would have dropped out this early. They would have. It's not like he was polling terribly. He could have at least gone to New Hampshire, which is what his whole campaign was geared around. The fact he pulled out now, I think we should give him credit for it.
Yeah, I'd also like to see his financial statements for the final quarter to see whether he was actually just going broke because all the donors said, nah, it's going to be Nikki Haley. But look, what impact on the race Chris Christie dropping out does very much remain to be seen. It is safe to say that those votes, the 12% in New Hampshire, few percent in Iowa as well, are not going to go to Donald Trump. But Christie did not endorse either of his main rivals. And making matters worse, he was caught on a hot mic, off stage, just before he made that speech. The web stream had already started. Journalists around America had already logged in. And, well, hear for yourself. He's not very flattering in his assessment of Nikki Haley's chances against Donald Trump. Listen in.
And she's going to get smoked. And you and I both know it. She's not up to this.
She hasn't even been.
She's still 20 points behind Trump in New Hampshire, right?
Yeah.
And he's still going to carry Iowa, right?
Yes. Oh, I talked to DeSantis called me. Petrified that I would.
He's probably getting out after Iowa. Well,
yeah, we don't know what he was going to say there. Petrified that I would ... probably drop out and hand extra points to Nikki Haley, but we don't know. The other voice there, as well, I should say, is the former New Hampshire Republican Party chairman, Wayne McDonald, who's been working on the Christie campaign. But he was there predicting that DeSantis will drop out after Iowa next week. Now, Chris Christie is saying that Nikki Haley is not up to it and that she is going to get smoked, presumably by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant and suggests that there is no way he can formally endorse Nikki Haley now.
Well, even more so, there was a leak about the supposed phone call with DeSantis.
When DeSantis called up Chris Christie, hoping for an endorsement or something.
Yeah. But what the leak was that Christie, during that phone call, described Nikki Haley as a joke, who he said performed terribly. So, I mean, it's not just not endorsing Nikki Haley, it's almost an anti-endorsement of Nikki Haley, what's been coming out.
Yeah, but that may not stop Chris Christie anti-Trump voters now going to Nikki Haley, particularly if Ron DeSantis doesn't do so well in Iowa. But it's fair to say that retail politicking in Iowa and New Hampshire, where these candidates often find themselves taking questions from a crowd of a few dozen people in a pizza restaurant or a coffee shop, it can create some awkward moments. Ordinary people have a way of asking tough real-world questions. They can be very disarming. Sometimes rival campaigns or rival parties also seed those crowds with hecklers or people to ask particularly awkward questions as well. So some of this is manufactured. Ron DeSantis, for example, really struggled to answer what was a fairly obvious and simple question from somebody who is a firm supporter of his in Iowa. This is the question and his response.
Why haven't you gone directly after? Polls are down. He's, up really.
What do you mean by going directly after?
I mean, you're in my viewpoint, you're going pretty soft on it.
But what do you think? So, because I've articulated all the differences time and time again on the campaign trail. I know. I think that there's just a narrative I think the narrative is this. I think what the media wants is they want Republican candidates to just kind of like smear him personally and kind of do that. That's just not how I roll.
It's not how he rolls. But DeSantis is blaming the media there for actually what I think DeSantis supporters want, or at least that guy does. We want you to attack Donald Trump. The problem that DeSantis has had, and he hasn't been able to reconcile, is he needs to win over Donald Trump's supporters, who represent 60% of the Republican primary electorate. You don't do that by attacking Trump. No. So you've got to try and keep your voters who hate Trump happy, but win over some people that quite like Trump, but give them a permission structure to move on. And he just hasn't figured out how to circle that square.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are Monday quarterbacking DeSantis' campaign because he isn't as charismatic as people would hope.
Yeah.
I think his strategy is sensible.
Yeah.
It just didn't come off. And maybe it was never going to come off. Trump's a strong candidate in the Republican Party.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. As for Nikki Haley, she hasn't had her own way since rising up through the polls because of good debate performances. She's also been getting a lot of scrutiny, and the rap on her now seems to be that she's, we don't know what she really thinks. She's trying to please too many people. She, again, like DeSantis, is trying to draw supporters away from Trump without making them feel like idiots for having supported Trump in the first place. The other day, though, she got what sounded like a pretty straightforward question, the kind of thing you get in a pop quiz in grade school. Take a listen.
What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was?
Government securing the rights of freedom of people, what people could or couldn't do. The issue, of course, in the Civil War was, could those people own other people or not? The word that she wouldn't, for some reason couldn't say was slavery. Yeah. So she then had to try and walk that back, explain it and clean it up.
Last night I was asked about the Civil War and what I think of the Civil War, what was the cause of the Civil War. Of course the Civil War was about slavery. We know that. That's unquestioned, always the case. We know the Civil War was about slavery.
Embarrassingly for Haley, though, she then blamed the question on a Democratic plant like it was their fault that she stuffed up. Even an actual plant could have answered that question better than she did. Yeah. Right off the back of that incident as well, Haley then made a poorly timed joke in New Hampshire.
We have an opportunity to get this right, and I know we'll get it right, and I trust you. I trust every single one of you. You know how to do this. You know Iowa starts it. You know that you correct it. You know that you continue to go. And then my sweet state of South Carolina brings it home. That's what we do. That's what we do.
And that was a poorly timed joke because Iowa hasn't voted yet.
Yeah.
And so DeSantis' super PAC immediately turned that into an attack ad for Iowan TV.
Nikki Haley told New Hampshire what she really thinks about Iowa.
You know Iowa starts it. You know that you correct it.
New Hampshire corrects Iowa?
Oh my gosh.
Nikki doesn't respect you. She thinks New England knows better.
Iowa starts it. You change personalities, you go into New Hampshire.
Why should Iowans support another fake politician who disrespects them?
Iowa starts it. You know that you correct it.
How can you trust Nikki Haley when she doesn't trust you?
So it was a tough week for Nikki Haley.
Yeah, and I guess we should explain as well, there is this parochialism between Iowa that have the first-in-the-nation caucus votes and then New Hampshire, which has the first-in-the-nation primary vote, usually just a week apart, as to who has the greater influence. In New Hampshire, they like to say, Iowa picks corn, New Hampshire picks presidents. Iowa doesn't like that, and so Nikki really stepped in it there. But look, this is the criticism that we're hearing a lot about Nikki Haley, that she's too worried about saying what she really feels at any given time. She keeps hedging her bet. She doesn't want to offend people, but still manages to do it. Her rivals are also pointing out that she's still, while trying to attack Donald Trump, refusing to rule out taking the vice presidency if it's offered to her. Well, joining us with more from Des Moines in Iowa is nationally syndicated conservative radio host Steve Deace. He's been appearing on the campaign trail in support of Ron DeSantis in recent days. Steve, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Happy to be here.
I wonder, Steve, as an evangelical Christian conservative yourself, how do you understand the appeal of Donald Trump to so many evangelicals in the state of Iowa? Are they blind to his flaws, or have they just become suddenly very pragmatic on the issue?
Well, no one's won a single delegate yet. We haven't had a vote, so we're not sure who he's won over or what he has done. He has won our state in the general election twice. No Republican has done that since Ronald Reagan, since going back to Eisenhower. But I think that has really much more to do with overall his policies, his economic policies were more favorable to rural America than what you typically see from Democrats these days. If you go back to the Iowa caucuses that were contested in 2016, and I helped oversee the Cruz campaign in Iowa in that race, we beat him here. And he actually had the lowest vote percentage of any primary that cycle, even though 2/3 of the turnout was evangelicals. So I think a lot of his support in Iowa is not, if it comes from churches, it's not church-based. It's much more of a response to the fact that his economic policies were better for rural America than what you see nowadays from Democrats.
How would you compare the Trump 2024 campaign to the Trump 2016 campaign? Is it a lot more professional now, or is it pretty much the same?
I think the campaign he has on the ground here is definitely better than what was in 2016. They were kind of just putting that together with Eventbrite and, people leaving their contact information. So, he has the benefits of incumbency. His organization is definitely better. I will say, as someone who helped build Ted Cruz's organization, Ron DeSantis' organization is the best in Iowa that I have ever seen. Now, whether the candidate can generate the energy in order to fully mobilize that, but organizationally, DeSantis has the edge, and frankly, it's not even close. I think for Trump, his organization is better, but his energy level is lower. There's nowhere near the excitement and energy level for Trump on the ground here than what we saw in leading up to 2016.
And Steve, let's talk a bit about your support of Governor Ron DeSantis in this campaign. He entered the race almost a year ago with sky-high hopes, and his polls have gone steadily down ever since, in Iowa and nationally as well. What's gone wrong, do you think?
If Ron DeSantis loses by 30 points in Iowa, I will be stunned. If Nikki Haley gets out of the teens in Iowa, I will be stunned. I think what happened here is, if you want to follow the polls, and I don't, I don't know how it goes in Australia, but the record of polling in America, as someone who has done this professionally for a living in the last decade or so, is absolutely dreadful. I mean, just absolutely dreadful. Okay. But I think if you look at the trajectory of the polling, if you go and look, March 30th of 2023, Donald Trump was leading Ron DeSantis by about single digits in the Real Clear Politics national polling average. 1 week later, he was up by 15 points. Now, what happened? Ron DeSantis wasn't even a candidate. In fact, Ron DeSantis would not be a candidate for another 2 months. So what occurred? What occurred is Donald Trump got indicted. So if you look at what is happening here, this entire process has been both been driven and stymied by the lawfare against President Trump. The Republican Party is not in control of its own primary. The Democratic Party lawfare is completely driving the Republican primary.
Now, it's supposed to be dreadfully cold on caucus night, and so when you combine that with Ron DeSantis' strong ground game, do you think the weather potentially helps the DeSantis campaign? Do you think it could actually make a difference in terms of actual points?
That'll be interesting. I don't know. The caucuses all take place around the state at night, 7 o'clock. And you have to be on, they lock the doors at 7. If you're not in the room, you don't get in. And you're going to be there for at least 30 minutes. In some places, you might be there for an hour, 90 minutes, depending how long it takes to handle official business while you're there. You'll hear speeches from the candidates' supporters. The candidates themselves will often show up at least one caucus site and speak on their own behalf. So this is a drawn-out process. It takes place at night after dinner. It's going to be bitterly cold. I think the president has a very devoted base of people. I mean, if you don't care if Donald Trump shoots somebody, I don't know that you're going to let minus 15-degree weather get in the way. I do think, though, there is another secondary layer of Trump support, aging boomers who, the kind of guys and men and women who just, are retired and just sit around when they're not at the casino and watch Fox News all day and they tell them what to think. Well, those people are going to have a hard time, I think, at 85, 80 years old, getting out and about in that kind of weather. And so there, I think it could be a factor, but it is also Iowa. We're used to winter around here. We have one every year.
I wonder, though, realistically, Steve, the way expectations play out in Iowa are arguably just as important, even more important than whether you win or lose. Do you do better than the polls have suggested you might do? Right now, the polls suggest Ron DeSantis is going to get 20%. How much better than that does he have to do for this to look like a win?
I think he'll absolutely finish no worse than second. I think that if he's into the 30s, if there's a 3 in front of his number, there will be no questions at all the next day about whether he should get out of the race or anything or not. If it's 27 or 28, I could see there being some of a debate. I think what will be very fascinating for the governor, though, is if Trump underperforms expectations, because I think that he will. I think Trump's numbers are going to be much closer to 40 than 50, if I had to guess. And then the media is going to be kind of torn, guys, because on one hand, they've been really trying hard to get this very unlikable octogenarian the nomination of our party for the last 7 months, so they can run their, same, mean tweet playbook at him. But on the other hand, it might be too hard for them to resist the temptation of Trump looking weakened in his first official ballot as a candidate at the same time. So, it'll be interesting to see how they decide to play that.
Steve Deace, thanks for joining us from Des Moines, Iowa on Planet America's Fireside Chat.
You guys, thank you very much. God bless.
And just to be clear, John, the reason we were speaking to an Iowa supporter is because for DeSantis, Iowa is everything. Nikki Haley is basing her campaign around New Hampshire. Yep. DeSantis is basing his campaign around Iowa. If he doesn't do well in 3 days' time, it's over for DeSantis.
Yeah, the question is, who gets to define how well he has done? Yeah. We'll see in a few days. We also spoke this week to longtime Iowa political reporter and host of the Iowa Press TV program, Kay Henderson. We asked her about what impact this deep freeze has been having on the presidential campaign this week and what the weather could mean on caucus night on Monday night.
Well, there have been some candidate events canceled this week. In some areas of the state, they got more than a foot of snow. The major interstate that runs through the center of the United States, Interstate 80, was closed in parts of Iowa because there were massive wrecks. So travel has been treacherous right now. I'm not a meteorologist, but the meteorologists that I talk to say that we're due for another round of snow on the weekend before the caucuses. And then we really get into a deep freeze. With winds, that means the feels like temperature could be 30 to 40 below. And so in those conditions, oftentimes people are told, hey, stay home. So President Trump, former President Trump, has been telling his people, you have to go, you have to caucus. And in fact, this past weekend, he said his people would, in his words, crawl on glass to get to the caucuses. The DeSantis campaign is, projecting confidence in the idea that their people are very committed and will be turning out for him.
Well, the United States Supreme Court is preparing to hear oral arguments on February the 8th over whether Donald Trump should be disqualified from the ballot in the state of Colorado. This case is going to centre on whether the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, enacted following the US Civil War in the 1860s, now prevents Trump from holding office again, office including the presidency. It all comes down to Section 3 of the 14th that says, in part, no person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Now, the Supreme Court in Colorado and a subsequent tribunal in the state of Maine have both concluded that, in fact, yes, Trump fits that definition. They say he was engaged in an insurrection on January the 6th and therefore is disqualified from being president again. But there are plenty of questions still to be answered in all of this.
There certainly are, and legally this could be a pretty close call, John. The Colorado Supreme Court's made up of 7 judges appointed by Democrats, and yet even they only decided 4 votes to 3 in favour of striking Trump off the ballot. Some of those questions you refer to, was the January 6th riot legally an insurrection? Did Trump officially engage in it, or did he give comfort to it? Is this a question that courts can even answer? Does he need to have a trial, or can he just be struck off the ballot without a trial? Interestingly to me personally, is the president actually an officer of the United States officially? Because if he's not, then Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't even apply to him. Now, that might sound like a ridiculous theory, but legal types have been debating that exact question ever since the 14th Amendment was drafted. Back in 1868, the Louisville Daily Journal was of the view that the president was not an officer of the United States. They noted the 3rd section of the 2nd article of the Constitution declares the president shall commission all the officers of the United States, which implies he is not one of those officers. This, we think, they wrote, is decisive. It appears to us to end the question. Well, they were wrong about that. It definitely did not end the question, but the Supreme Court has agreed to try to end the question soon. Trump, unsurprisingly, is less than enthused about all these developments.
It's no wonder crooked Joe Biden and the far-left lunatics are desperate to stop us by any means necessary. They are willing to violate the U.S. Constitution at levels never seen before in order to win this election. Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. It's a threat.
Whereas Biden is leaving the decision to the courts, well, kind of. He did sort of prejudge some of those legal questions.
You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, we'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero.
The Supreme Court will decide about that. What we do know, though, is that one person is 100% wrong legally, and that is, unsurprisingly, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
If the Democrats want to start making these rules, well, guess what? We can use the same exact rules. For example, we could take Joe Biden off the ballot in red states and other states because he is committing treason with his border policies, and the invasion has gotten so bad at the southern border. We could also take his name off the ballot because of the impeachment inquiry that we've been doing on the Oversight Committee, and we produced evidence that Joe Biden has definitely participated in Hunter Biden's business deals with foreign countries and sold his power for political favors, and he's received the financial benefit from that because we have the checks.
No, I'm not sure you can prove those things. And even if you could, you can't just strike someone off the ballot for being bad. They have to have engaged in an insurrection under this provision of the Constitution. None of those things she mentioned were insurrections. By the way, Trump is the last person who should complain about people trying to strike candidates off the ballot. He made his political name by trying to get Obama struck off the ballot for supposedly being born in Kenya. And even at the same time as he was accusing Colorado of being anti-democratic for striking him off the ballot, he was trying to get Nikki Haley struck off the ballot for birtherism reasons too, which, by the way, are also rubbish. That's one black kettle right there, John.
Yeah, but that also does go to the 14th Amendment and eligibility to be President of the United States. It's Section 1 that says you have to be a natural-born US citizen, minimum 35 years of age, to be President. One of the arguments is to say, well, Section 1 is the one that refers to the President. Section 3 is everybody else who might take an oath of office in the United States. Therefore, well, Trump can't be excluded on the basis of that. The finding here, it seems pretty likely that it's going to go in Trump's favour. We'll wait and see. We'll get some expert opinion on that in just a moment. But the reasons why it goes in Trump's favour are going to be very interesting in all this. Does he get off on a technicality, or do they assert, in fact, it has not been proven that he took part in an insurrection, for instance, or a rebellion, because that could turn into a win for Donald Trump, even ahead of the Jack Smith case, if the Supreme Court of the United States has said Trump is not an insurrectionist. It could lead to that as well. We'll have to just wait and see.
That's a fair point. Before we go to the interviewee, though, there's a few other cases we should mention. You already referred to the immunity appeal. I just want to explain that quickly for our viewers. Essentially, Trump's lawyers are arguing that he can't be prosecuted for January 6 or anything to do with that because he is immune from being charged for any acts that he has committed that could be linked in any way, shape or form to his official duties. So they say that January 6 was in relation to him trying to look after an election, which is his duty. And
ensure the integrity of the outcome of the election.
Exactly. Now, the three judges, there was a panel of three judges on the appeals court that this was argued in front of. They really made mincemeat out of that argument. In particular, a Biden-appointed judge, the Judge Pam, she put the argument to him, to the Trump lawyer, well, what if Biden wants to assassinate his opponent? Is he allowed to do that and not be charged? And they can get SEAL Team 6 to take him out. And they said no, because he'll be impeached. And that's an exception. If he's impeached, then he can be charged. And she goes, what if he's not impeached? What if he resigns? Or what if this is at the end of his administration and so he doesn't have time to be impeached? He will be impeached. Okay, well, even if he is impeached, isn't that then an exception? You're saying he's immune. At the same time, you're saying there's an exception to the immunity, which means that's not an immunity. They didn't really have much of an answer for that. So anyway, they really chopped up that argument, but they're going to try and appeal the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and it's a blatant hypocrisy as well in terms of Trump's legal defences, because back at the time of Trump being impeached, his legal team were arguing, oh no, he really must be criminally tried on these matters, not impeached over these matters. And we are talking about the same thing, the January 6th attack on the Capitol building. In fact, there are so many Trump cases going through the courts right now. It is hard to keep up. There is the second civil defamation case brought by E. Jean Carroll, who Trump has already been found liable to have sexually abused during a proceeding in New York last year. She was awarded $5 million damages. That's continuing next week. Also in New York this week, that fraud case is wrapping up, and Trump has already been found guilty in that. The question is what damages, what sanctions there'll be against the Trump Corporation.
And also there's the Georgia case, the Georgia RICO case, which is about the January 6 as well. And there's been developments in that one as well, which is that the DA who's in charge of that has she has appointed a prosecutor who she allegedly has been having an affair with, and she has allegedly paid him way more money than she should and has paid other prosecutors, and that some of that money has been spent on romantic getaways between her and him, and there is some suggestion that she is guilty of fraud, and Trump's people have a lot to say about this. This news has only just broken in the last few days, but there is a certain amount of evidence about this, and we'll be hearing more about it over the next
Unlike some of the previous allegations that said that Fawny Willis was having an affair with a rapper and a gangster and somebody else as well, it does seem it's one of those huge if true things, if there is actually something to this.
In this case, she's already been subpoenaed to testify in that man's divorce proceedings. So that was before the story came out.
So there is a connection there. We just don't know how deep or improper it might be. Sai Prakash is Professor of Law at the University of Virginia, and he's the author of several books on presidential powers. And he joins us now from Virginia. Sai, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's start with this presidential immunity case that's working its way through the courts. Those 3 Federal Appeals Court justices this week seemed, at least to my eyes, rather sceptical of the arguments that Trump's lawyers are putting forward in this case. Do you see any legal merit to it?
I think the president will ultimately lose, but I think they probably thought that anyway. I think the main goal of the argument was to delay the trial. And this was thought to be a threshold issue. The district court ruled against Trump if it decided to keep the trial, hold the trial in abeyance. And then, of course, they're now waiting for the appeals process to play out. So the circuit court will decide, and then Trump will seek Supreme Court review.
Well, given that, do you think the main January 6th trial will be delayed, or do you think all these appeals could be taken care of by March?
Well, that's a great question. It's hard to say because the appeals court will now draft an opinion. And of course, there might be concurrences and dissents, and that will take time. It's not something that, is often done overnight. It's a question of how quickly do the appeals court judges wish to act. And then, of course, President Trump will have time to file for what we call here a writ of certiorari, which is a request for the court to exercise its discretion, the Supreme Court of the U.S., to exercise its discretion to hear the case. And they will then take time to consider that petition, and they'll probably ask for the reviews of the government. They'll probably ask the other party to respond. The other party, of course, is the government. And then they'll make a decision as to whether they take the case or not. If they take the case, then we're talking about, a much longer delay. If they don't take the case, as I suspect they won't, then it'll be shorter. So we have to stay tuned to figure out whether there's going to be a delay or not. But to circle back to your first question, you can imagine situations where there would be some sort of merit to the claim that the president's entitled to official immunity for his official acts, more specifically criminal law immunity for his official acts. And I think if you're a judge, you might be most amenable to the idea in the context of decisions made as commander-in-chief. But in this case, it's not even clear that these are the official acts of President Donald J. Trump as opposed to candidate Donald J. Trump. And then even if they are his official acts, it's not clear that they should be accorded any sort of official immunity. So this is not the best case for arguing that there ought to be some sort of immunity inferred from the Constitution, because as your viewers may well be aware, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution saying that the president has any immunity from criminal prosecution.
Well, Professor, let's have a look at that other case where they're trying to figure out what may or may not be meant by the US Constitution, the 14th Amendment case involving Trump being kicked off the ballot for the Colorado primary. What do you think are the major implications of that case?
Well, we have a federal system that, in a way that Australia does as well. And so every state is able to decide for itself what the Constitution means, subject to review by the Supreme Court. So Colorado's decision doesn't have any necessary or logical implications for what other states and other state courts might do. Having said that, at least one other state Secretary of State has decided that she agrees with the Colorado Supreme Court and has said that Trump can't be on the ballot. I suspect that, the Supreme Court will decide this question quickly, and there won't be any further fallout from it, because I believe in this case, President Trump's likely to win.
I just want to focus on one of the arguments that you touched on before. It's the one that conservatives use the most. And it's just not fair to strike Trump off the ballot for engaging in insurrection without a proper trial and a conviction. They say that Jack Smith had the choice. He chose not to charge him with engaging in an insurrection. So how can he possibly be punished for doing so? What's your response to that argument?
Well, it's a plausible argument, right? The Constitution just says if you've engaged in insurrection and rebellion and you have previously taken oath to support the Constitution, then you can't serve in any number of offices. It doesn't specify who decides that question. It doesn't specify how they must decide that question, what process they must undertake. And that's the debate that we're having in this country. Who decides that? When do they decide it? How do they decide it? And President Trump wants to say it's only Congress. Of course, it doesn't say that. Other parties want to say it's anybody who's involved in the political system, including secretaries of state, state courts, federal courts, voters, electors. members of Congress. And, because it doesn't say who decides that question, it's up for a rich debate that we're now having.
Finally, one more case to get your thoughts on. There are so many. If the current allegations that are out there, that Fani Willis in Georgia fraudulently hired her chief prosecutor and overpaid him deliberately to benefit her so that they could use that money to go off on romantic holidays together. If any of those allegations are true, what effect does that potentially have on the Georgia RICO case against Trump? And is it potentially fatal for the Georgia RICO case?
As a formal matter, it doesn't matter in the sense that, they can have someone else continue with the prosecution, someone that's not in a relationship with Fani Willis, right? I don't think it taints the prosecution in a legal sense. It obviously is not welcome publicity for Fani Willis, right? Because it suggests there's some shenanigans going on. It suggests it's not very professional. The claim is that this attorney who's taken over the case has never prosecuted a RICO case before. These are complex cases. So there'll be a lot of questions about why he was chosen and whether these allegations are true, none of which will redound to her credit, which might indirectly taint the case. But ultimately, I don't know if it prevents the prosecution from going forward, right? It just means you might have to have another prosecutor appointed who doesn't have this baggage and perhaps has a better history or track record of dealing with these kinds of complicated cases.
Professor Sai Prakash from the University of Virginia Law School. Thanks for being with us on Planet America's Fireside Chat.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you might recall late last year when that budget standoff in Congress threatened to shut down the United States government, they did manage to pass another short-term fix, kicking the can down the road just a little bit more. Well, next week they catch up to that can, or at least one of the cans they kicked down the road. This is a deadline for an agreement next Friday for the first bunch of funding. And this week, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson had a bit of good news. They've agreed on the bottom line, or at least the top line, how much they're prepared to spend.
The nearly $1.6 trillion budget for 2024 is ironically the same amount in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was negotiated by former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden last summer.
And we know what they did since last summer. A handful of Republicans knifed the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. And Mike Johnson could be facing the same fate, Chaz, if Conservatives don't like the fine print.
Well, I can tell you now, Conservatives don't like the fine print.
Okay.
Spoiler, with good reason. Firstly, that number we just played is wrong because the deal also includes a $69 billion side deal for extra spending negotiated between Biden and McCarthy
$60
last year.
billion, nothing.
Trifles. So the actual number is $1.66 trillion. But it gets worse, because as part of that deal last year, they negotiated default spending levels that would come into effect if no budget deal was struck by April this year. Turns out those defaults were actually more favourable to Republicans than this deal. So to be clear, if Mike Johnson had just kept kicking that can down the road, then in May this year, non-defence spending would have been automatically cut by $40 billion and defence spending would have been cut by $10 billion. That is what's driving Conservatives crazy. This is the graph that Chip Roy is waving around. If Johnson had done nothing, they would have delivered the third column, but his deal created the fourth column of spending, which has got smoke and cracks, which involved more spending than in Nancy Pelosi's last budget. So that's one reason they're annoyed. Another is because the House Freedom Caucus have clearly stated that they cannot and must not continue funding the government without immigration reform. But Mike Johnson has explicitly already stated that he will pass a budget regardless of the state of immigration negotiations. So he has rejected them there as well. Now, just to be clear, with all the Republicans resigning or getting sick or being drummed out of Congress recently, it will soon take only 2 Republicans plus the Democrats to dump Mike Johnson as Speaker. And this is what Chip Roy had to say on our mate Steve Deace's show this week.
If they totally botch it, we get no policy reforms, and we're spending at $1.66 trillion. I don't know why we would keep him as Speaker. I just got to be honest. I don't know why we would do that. I'm leaving it on the table. I'm not going to say I'm going to go file it tomorrow. I'm not saying I'm not going to file it tomorrow. I think the Speaker needs to know that we're angry about it.
And interesting, Chaz, when we spoke to Steve Deace, we also asked him, because he knows Chip Roy quite well, personally as well as professionally. They've been touring campaigning for DeSantis over the last week or so in Iowa. Steve, what chance do you think there is that Chip Roy will lead a charge to get rid of Mike Johnson? And Steve Deace said to us, about 50-50. So those are high odds. Meanwhile, as to the immigration question, Mitch McConnell earlier today reportedly telling Republican colleagues now is the time to get immigration done because Democrats want it now and they will not do immigration reform if and when Donald Trump is re-elected to a second term. Now is the time when it's in Democrat interests to get a deal done because it is damaging to them. They need to try and neutralise it politically. So this could be one of those moments where the planets align.
Yeah, you're right about immigration being damaging to them. 300,000 plus interceptions on the border last month.
Yep.
That's a huge record. The Democrats need this issue to go away.
Yeah. Now, before we go, Chaz, it should have been a very straightforward kind of a situation. Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin was diagnosed with prostate cancer in early December. Not unusual for a man in his 60s. He was admitted to the Walter Reed Military Medical Centre to have his prostate removed on December 22nd. And that procedure seemed to go very well. He was sent home the very next day in time to spend Christmas with his family. But then on New Year's Day, the day began with Austin talking to Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He also joined a teleconference with President Biden and his national security and military advisors. They all talked about the situation in the Middle East. So far, so good. But that night, Lloyd Austin began to feel unwell. He was experiencing intense abdominal pain. He was rushed by ambulance back to Walter Reed, and the next day he was admitted to intensive care, turns out with severe complications from that prostate operation. But the problem was, Chaz, at no stage in any of that did Lloyd Austin or his staff inform the White House or even his deputy at the Pentagon, Kathleen Hicks, that he had cancer, was going to the hospital the first time or the second time. Even when Kathleen Hicks was handed some of his powers during that holiday period, she didn't know why she had those powers. Just that, yep, it's you for a bit, you answer the phone, you keep an eye on the emails. Now, some Pentagon officials found out before the President of the United States was informed and before this story became public last week. And now the Pentagon is kind of going all the other way, giving us lots of gory details, trying to be as transparent as possible.
Secretary Austin has taken responsibility for the issues with transparency, and the department is taking immediate steps to improve our notification procedures.
So to be clear, the White House didn't know where the Defence Secretary of the United States was for 3 days. Turns out he was in intensive care.
This is while they were bombing someone in Iraq, by the way.
Yeah, so a country basically at war. Republicans are calling for Lloyd Austin to be sacked. They're painting a picture of a chaotic and dysfunctional Biden administration.
The Secretary of Defense was in the ICU, the Deputy Secretary of Defense was on vacation, and Joe Biden and the White House were completely unaware.
And it's not just Republicans. At least one Democrat is now calling for Austin to resign as well. So far, the White House says that Austin has the president's complete support, which presumably means within 48 hours he'll retire for medical reasons or something.
Maybe so, but I want to put up a kind of a defence. Let's just take a step back, look at exactly who was told what and when, because I think it's important. Austin got sick on January 1, like you said. On January 2, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was told he had been hospitalised. Austin's Chief of Staff was also told, and so was the Pentagon Press Secretary. Now, his Chief of Staff was sick with the flu, though, so she didn't tell the White House. Austin's deputy, as you said, was told to assume some of Austin's duties while she was on holiday, was not told he was hospitalised, although apparently that's not unusual for a deputy to take over duties without being told why. Apparently that's standard. Then the White House and the deputy learnt he was hospitalised 2 days later, and the Pentagon told Congress and the press the day after that, although neither the White House nor the press knew Austin had prostate cancer until 4 days after that. Quite a long delay. Now, Austin's been a good soldier. He's taken responsibility, saying, this is important to say. It was my medical procedure and I take full responsibility for my decisions about disclosure. Ultimately, it is his responsibility, yes. Yeah. But to be fair, he did tell the person he's meant to tell, who is not the president, it's his Chief of Staff. She is meant to tell the president, and the Pentagon press secretary was also told. It's not Austin's fault that his press secretary didn't do her job because she was sick. Now, if she was too sick to function, she should have told someone else to do her job for her. So why didn't she? We don't know. The Pentagon press secretary declined to answer multiple questions about why the Chief of Staff didn't delegate her authority to notify the president. And by the way, why didn't the Pentagon press secretary do anything, seeing as he knew all the time as well? This is a massive screw-up, no doubt about that. But if Austin is to be sacked, I reckon he should take some friends with him because I don't think he's totally responsible.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is subject to an internal Pentagon investigation. So we'll find out in the next month whether they're just going to be procedural and reporting changes or whether heads are going to roll. But in the meantime, it is not a good look for President Joe Biden, who did not know what was going on with his own defence secretary. It may not be his fault either, but he was out of the loop. And this does feed into that narrative that Joe Biden's a kind of part-time ageing president, doesn't really know what's going on in his administration. But that is it for another Fireside Chat. We will be back next week, though, to wrap up the Iowa caucuses and preview the following week's New Hampshire primaries.
And Plan America Wednesday returns the following week, Wednesday the 31st of January on ABC TV. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.